Good night, everyone. This is Rillian from the 2_MK group. Today I'll be streaming from Amara 2_MK to our main 2_MK channel with full permission. Today we're covering the concept of buffs and debuffs in a fighting game. Those of you who are familiar with MOBAs or similar RPG style play know that a lot of the Twitch reactions in those games are based around making sure that your opponent has the correct effects on them to allow you to win either a 1v1, team fight, or anything like that. Now, I've been actually looking into ways to explain to people that fighting games contain these same principles. It's just that most people don't actually talk about them. The higher level players are so above them that they're not seeing the same things as everyone else. And lower level players therefore have a lot more trouble becoming familiar with these and getting introduced to what exactly is going on. So I'm going to be looking through some of Amara's older matches. These are just from a few days ago, and I was trying to explain this concept to her in full detail, and I'm now going to be explaining it for our viewers and general content. Since Amara plays Ryu, it makes it relatively easy to do this, given that Ryu is pretty clear in how he works and what it causes to other opponents. But if you don't identify it, it actually becomes really difficult to play Ryu because he's one of the characters who depends on it the most. If you're familiar with the character Jacko Valentine from Guilty Gear, she actually is effectively a MOBA character, but she only has a certain number of these so-called status effects. In terms of what you actually want to see from any given opponent, Jacko has a lot more ways of pushing people around before she actually does anything than Ryu does. However, I can still explain in fairly strong detail what exactly it is that Ryu wants to do. There may be some moments where I pause this and move forward with just a few frames at a time, but this shouldn't be too often. The basic concept of Birdie as a character is that he's good at neutral, and when you try to zone him too blatantly, he gets away relatively easily and can take you by surprise and catch you instead. But as you can see, in this match, Amara's not really having troubles per se yet. Birdie's damage is the bigger problem here. Cross-ups, not being ready for particular things, and so on. This would look entirely like a normal match to anyone who is just getting used to this game and not particularly used to Birdie as a character. So we see movement and interactions, but as matches go on, there's more likely that your opponent will pick up information based on your tendencies. However, you can manipulate the information they pick up to put what we will consider to be status effects on them. This isn't really something that you have to aim to do. This is something that just happens as a natural consequence of this game, but you have to be able to recognize what it is that's happening. Birdie fortunately is a character who has a lot of different ways of doing things, and therefore he doesn't need to do a lot of stuff early. You can understand him without specifically going for this sort of thing. But as you can see, the general flow of this person's style is slightly decipherable. You can look at some patterns here and start to make decisions based on those patterns alone. However, I can also tell you that for the most part, just as in a MOBA, a character has certain abilities. Even in games like Overwatch, and those of you who are familiar with Ultra David's concept of this, is that basically in some ways, and once you've tied this in many ways, games like Overwatch and Paladins and so on are technically close to fighting games. I won't necessarily go so far as to call them fighting games. I'll leave that explanation to him if you want to know more about that. head on over to his Twitter or to Ultrastand TV, but the concept that they are using the same sort of thinking when a quick interaction begins is basically correct. The difference being that there's no laning phase here, much. And fighting games are basically all quick interactions. There's no team, but duels are a thing. So we're going to look at this match differently than the other. We were using the other mainly to show you what this particular birdie player, the cool name Marcus Garvey, has decided to use as their main methods of fighting. Note, however, that the first thing that happens when Amarash manages to uppercut this opponent is that they stop. They keep defending. Yet whenever she hits them with a fireball, even if they block it, they seem to move more for some reason. All you have to understand about that is the opponent is either encouraged or discouraged to take certain actions based on actions you're taking. But in some games, and in some matchups, this can be really strong effect-wise, and you can use it to your advantage. Notice again, the player got Shoryuken and became defensive. It seems like an obvious choice. If you got knocked out of the air for approaching, you'd presumably want to not do that again. But most people do this without even thinking too hard about what they're doing. They just automatically do this. This is where the autopilot concept comes from. It goes far beyond offense. Many players will autopilot neutral and autopilot defense. You'll note that whenever they get hit with a long range Hadouken from nearly full screen, they wait for the next one and hop over it. If they are not as far away, they tend to jump. This means that if you wanted this player to do their jump in that spacing, all you have to do is hit them with Hadouken. We will consider that the main status effect. The effect of making your opponent want to attack you. Some games, older RPGs will consider that Berserk. We can call it Frenzy. It doesn't specifically matter what you call it, as long as you can identify it. So we will probably call it Frenzy for various reasons related to both MOBAs and a particular character archetype. At the time that this was starting off, I was not actually going to explain this, because it seemed to me as if this was a regular match. It could have gone better, but it's not really something you need to deal with. But the important thing is that you understand that there is some habit that you might have that comes from being hit with a status effect. More importantly though, the reason I ended up explaining it then was that, hey, there was another birdie. So it wasn't a waste of time at that point. It was something I could quickly do, knowing that the last reference, and with a birdie matchup fresh in her mind, I was able to tell Amara what to do relative to quote-unquote status effects. These are relative to matchup, which makes them even more complicated than MOBAs, but MOBAs and similar games do have some aspects of that where a particular character is good at getting out of a certain effect, and we'll get to that later. Fortunately for us all, Birdie is not a character that is good at getting out of or erasing his own status effects. Now, players may differ very slightly in what causes them to frenzy, but when you tie this in with their with your understanding of other typings of players, it's not so weird. And as you can see, Birdie players will still probably go for the dolphin dive as it's known. They'll wait a little bit, but usually that's what's on their mind. Usually the way to think about it is to recognize that once you've caused a status effect in your opponent, the thing they are thinking about has changed. Not necessarily the thing they do right away, but the thing they are thinking about is probably different. So it could have been done in this match to basically throw a Hadouken and wait long enough for the opponent to do that. Now, this is a really simple status effect. It wears off very quickly. Once you've probably gotten the opponent to do the hop right after. If they've done the dolphin dive and gotten hit probably once, the effect was really short. It wears off. They don't necessarily go back to it, especially since you've hit them with something different at that point. Some status effects last much longer, and in general you can remember it this way. The less damage a status effect does to be applied, the longer it's likely to last. This also helps if your opponent doesn't have a good way to put offense on you without dismissing whatever was coming before. In contrast to a MOBA where you have very specific effects and characters who tend to resist them in larger quantities, this is a lot more like one of the old Final Fantasy style RPGs where you have many more status effects and you're trying to apply the right one for the particular type of boss or enemy that you're facing. But let's again bring it back down to the simplicity of what Birdie is susceptible to. At lower levels, Birdie players will tend to get ready to do Dolphin Dive after being hit by or blocking a Hadouken. And this is simply so that they can get in and do damage rather than being stuck at the other side of the screen, being zoned out the entire time. You'll note, however, that this player's status effect is still in effect. The longer a round goes on, the more times you apply a particular status effect, the more likely it is that the player will keep doing a particular thing. This is how you condition people. Preferably without taking too much damage. But we'll get to that part later because that's extremely complicated. On the other side, Amara is basically taking the same setup. When she gets hit by certain moves, it causes her to freeze up in particular ways and get baited. And this time, I could basically have told her at this moment, you're going to get thrown again. But it's not really a read at that point, it's a status effect. You understand why it is that the person got hit, and you understand what's on their mind at that point. So when we're looking at Ryu, rather than trying to figure out something as complicated as Jackal, we're looking at more or less 5 effects. Because most characters only have about 5 distinct move concepts, even if they use different moves to achieve the same thing. Ryu throws fireballs. He does forward and back throw, which reposition the opponent. He does shoryukens, usually as anti-airs. Target combo to knock people down. And technically that's about it. The Tatsu can come in as well, but what exactly that means tends to vary a lot more heavily because it's not considered something most people will specifically want you to do. So it's not as strong. Well, moving on to Cammy, we have a different perspective because Cammy has a lot more ways in than Birdie does. She has a lot more concepts based on, I am going to be out of the way of your main attack and then strike you with my own. And she has this for many, many, many attack types. Relative to other characters, she's very good at getting around attacks if she can see them coming. which also means that it's very likely that a Kami player will be thinking about how to get around your stuff rather than how to defend from it. But note this one. Kami, like Karine, doesn't like when you are the one that has controlled the distance of the match. Kami and Karine players, and you can easily see it if you have watched Kanzuki Dynasty fight, they don't like when you have controlled the distance between you and them. And before you can do any walking to get back into some position that is even more disadvantageous to them, they're usually going to jump just to see what they can get done. Kami players are more likely to jump than Karine players because they have dive kick and can do something about it. But let's simplify this some more. We're going to cut all of that out and think purely about whether or not Kami has a way to stop Ryu from doing certain things. And if she doesn't, what that causes the person to think about or feel. This is the knockdown. And they wake up with a particular button, they get around some stuff, and then we have a Shoryuken. So we know that they wake up with that button. That's not really helpful in Amara's case at this point. But here's a back throw, and they jump. Why did they jump? They jump because of what I just mentioned. Space has been controlled. Ryu controlled how far away Kami was. So it became disfavorable to them to let that situation continue in the way it did. And that's the only thing from this match that you specifically need to keep in mind, because it will come up again and again and again. That is the nature of these. So we're going to consider that frenzy in this case also, because Kami lacks the tools to immediately attack people who have just controlled the distance between them, especially against Ryu or someone else who could easily anticipate that she was going to do a particular thing. So she jumps because she is a character who can turn her jump into two different things and therefore becomes harder to anticipate. It's also a long range at which it's difficult to anti-air her even if you move forward with most characters. Some can, but given the input lag of the game and little extra movements, most people, especially at this level, don't actually think to themselves, let me walk forward and hit Kami or jump to knock her out of the air, because all sorts of weird things can happen when you do that. So the Kami player's perspective is, I should attack. And that is the concept of frenzy in this case. I should attack. Whether or not they specifically jump is less meaningful, but this is the other aspect of it. Once they've been hit by the Shoryuken, especially the light one, we will consider that status effect to be slow. Because now they're at a range where they can't really counterattack well, but they don't really want to jump, they could get hit, they don't want to walk in, so they're thinking, how do I get around the attack that is probably coming now? The attack that's probably coming from Ryu is a Hadouken, so they hit a safe move that would go through a Hadouken. And those two are the key things that you need to understand about the status effects going on in this match. A Shoryuken causes slow, as does being a particular distance away, but more so the Shoryuken specifically. And the back throw causes a frenzy. So we see the turn knuckle, the dance around turn knuckle, that comes after the Shoryuken. Notice this, it's basically only light Shoryuken, but here's the back throw and the jump. The other interactions in the match, to a high level player, There are no other real interactions. This is just weirdness that's going on in their mind. They're just waiting to see which status effects to use to win. Also note that an EX Shoryuken puts Kami in a different spacing relative to Ryu and a different timing as well. This is why I say only the light one matters here. They can eventually show the same reaction style, but you should still consider it such that a status effect is delivered only by a particular version of a move most of the time. If you don't do this, you'll confuse yourself eventually. So again, we're still looking for just light Shoryukens, or medium ones depending, and back throws. Everything else, to someone who is studying the game from the perspective of status effects, everything else is fluff. So there's a Shoryuken, and they stop and they slow down, and then comes that. Note that they do delay a bit. The delay isn't really relevant. If you've played such games, you know that the opponent, the creature or whatever, doesn't lose the effect just because they moved around a bit. They usually have to do something. Amara, on the other hand, I'll point out later, has a very strong tendency to jump when cornered. And cornered is another thing you can consider to be a status effect that I'll bring up again later. So far we know Frenzy and Slow. What delivers those effects to opponents is different, but Slow is when they have become defensive, watching the ground, or approaches, and they're less likely to move about or hit buttons. And Frenzy is when they feel as if they must attack. Some characters have a tendency to jump, and some do not. When you understand how to apply this as a general thing, it will become both easier to understand your opponent's patterns and to force them into thinking particular ways for conditioning purposes. It doesn't really matter what labels you use or how you remember the status effects themselves, only that you have some basic idea of how it works in any given matchup, and even if you don't fully understand it, you can usually look at the opposing character's tools for dealing with certain things, and that will teach you their immunities. Akuma at most lower levels is a relatively simple character to deal with if you understand this, because Akuma is generally frenzied most of the time because this is beneficial. You can put Akuma in frenzy and it probably doesn't harm him at all. What Akuma players don't like is being cornered. And they also don't like being deprived of their offense, because, I mean, why would you play Akuma if you didn't like offense? So here's guard. You're guarding the corner position because you expect your opponent to try to jump out of it eventually. But why? The reason for this is primarily because Akuma doesn't actually have a lot of good tools to get out of the corner. And the player tends to be focused on doing damage. As you can see there, he can't Tatsu to push you back, to get out of the corner that way, to even just risk it because it might hit you. Demon Flip is usually going to be intercepted. For the most part, Akuma has very few options. He can medium kick Tatsu, but depending on where you stand, even that won't work. So here we go again. We corner the player a little bit. I will also note something that I noted to Amara, that if you back throw an Akuma player, they don't actually have to reach the corner, they just have to feel as if they're about to. It tends to lead them into jumping. It's not a character that walks backward a lot. So back to the corner. And we do see some slowdown there because they had enough time to recognize I should probably stop doing this because I keep on reacting to being cornered and it goes poorly. The more you apply a particular status effect to an opponent, the harder it is to keep applying it. They recognize that you're doing it. They become resistant to it. If the character is one that doesn't have a lot of options, or if the player is easily frustrated, it means that they effectively have lower resistance. If the character has tools that are difficult to use, but can get them out of it, you might see some different behavior, another layer or level of behavior. But in terms of Akuma, in terms of understanding Akuma as a character being fought by Ryu, or anyone with a particularly good back throw, honestly, the idea is to stand where Akuma is unlikely to get out of the corner without taking damage, and wait a little bit there. This may sound like a really obvious thing, but there are certain characters who are completely immune to this effect, and you will be able to see and understand by contrast if I end up showing any of those on this stream. So at this point, there's no real benefit to Amara's play except to try to do this again. So they've cornered themselves somewhat, but note how quickly they attempt to get out of it. No one likes being in the corner, but you'll understand that over time Akuma players really don't like it. So standing right here, again, note that their actual buttons don't reach far enough for it to be terrifying. And depending on what they try to do, your reactions could easily take care of it. Most of us instinctively understand our characters to know my character does not deal with this or does not create a problem for the opponent right here. So we cornered them, and they saw an opportunity to get out, and therefore stopped. But again, notice, even though they take long-ish to actually do that, the same thing happens. They don't come up with a new tricky thing. Most Akuma will not do things like walking forward into footsie's range to try to hit crouching medium kick or crouching heavy punch at this level. Most of them are going to eventually jump. They will be thinking about when can I jump, when should I jump? Can I throw Hadoukens first and then jump? But for the most part, the idea is I need to jump out of this corner. One could think that, well, most Akumas want to jump all the time, but not really. The status effect of cornered, however, is relatively universal to them. So far we know cornered, which works on Akuma for sure. To Kami, maybe, we don't know yet. We know that Kami and Birdie can be frenzied and slowed, and that Akuma's frenzy state can be ignored. Now let's look at a much more complex character in terms of status effects. We could consider her to not be that complex in terms of execution or plan, but status effects are a much harder thing to deal with Lara, because Lara players have a lot of options. They just don't have a lot of options in a particular space. And it is because they don't have options in that space that the status effect relative to that space is easily applied. The thing you're looking for here is the fact that Lara is basically unable to do damage and walk forward at the same time. This might seem a little weird, but there are characters who have moves that take them forward when they do them. so they can keep on poking you, and then just hit the next button to poke again, and if your reaction is off, that's it. But Lara only has one move like this, and it's really unsafe, so what do you have to do? You have to stay out of her range so that she can't do anything in particular. Because then she will try to do something. It causes a frenzy effect based purely on you being slightly out of range. This is the first effect you can see where you don't actually have to hit any buttons or do anything to put it into effect. All you have to do is stand at a particular spot, and Lara gains frenzy as a general thing. But there's a better way to put that frenzy up more heavily. You can really force the issue. That. Lara is really weak to that, relative to most characters, because she can't spend a lot of time crouch blocking and still expect to win, at least not at the lower levels. So if she's slightly out of range, she has to hit buttons, and many of us have sweeps that low profile or in some way change hitbox or hurtbox, to the point where, yeah, your higher buttons are not bothering me, but you're now in range for me to just hit you. Sweep, however, must usually be done because most of us don't have a crouch medium kick long enough to do this, but sweep will tend to be. And since you're not really worried about the startup of the move, it's not for a punish or anything, you use it then. You do have to learn to read the distance a bit more so than for other characters. But we weren't doing much here. Amara was not actually putting that into full effect as yet. Because as I said, it's more complicated overall, and interactions with Lara tend to appear to be in Lara's favor much more often. Fortunately, this is an almost universal status effect. Only the characters with the absolute slowest versions of sweep, or the least safe versions of sweep, should be worried about doing this. If your sweep has really slow startup, like Bison slide startup, maybe Mika slide startup, you might want to consider other options, but you probably also have buttons that do similar things. Because you're not really looking for something that hits low. She's probably walking forward anyway. It just happens to help if it hits low. You're just looking for something that reaches longer than her regular range and then leads into weird stuff. Hopefully, a fairly quick button. Probably not a medium button. So now where we are, spacing wise, around here. If you were ready to hit sweep instead, on most characters you're better off. You can base an entire game plan around, okay, I'm going to wait until Lara tries to move and then sweep. Part of the reason for this is that Lara is not a character who's really good at whiff punishing lows. She can totally hit you, especially if you happen to clip her when you didn't mean to. But Lara's sticking out buttons and you're trying to either whiff punish those buttons or catch her walking in. And her buttons are most likely only going to clip you if you do very specific things or if you have a sweep that leaves its hurt box out there really long. Most characters sweep don't actually. Ryu and Cammy are particularly good at getting their hurt box out of the way again. Once you have hit them the sweep, they're annoyed because now they were in an offensive mindset and then got stopped. So if you then dash up close to them, you might get a couple moments where they're under a separate effect where you could probably bait them into doing something. Especially especially if you're the type who doesn't normally do things on people's wake up, and everyone knows that sweep isn't really good for that. Most sweeps don't give you any Oki or anything, so people are more likely to hit something on the wake up because they figure that you're going to try to get knocked away. But if you have a good eyeball meaty, then they'll start to get flustered. So here we have sweep. Hadouken. Now the problem is that for some reason Amara's setup for this against Lara involves jumping after the Hadouken, which doesn't work if you already have this particular status effect on Lara. There are other effects as well. The one you just saw is often one you see when you get too many knockdowns on Lara in a short space of time. It's usually about 3. You can see it happen to Omni Rabbit. They'll tend to just wake up with EX Bolt because they've had enough of that. But the overall goal in this match is to make Lara upset enough about being knocked down to stop doing certain things. And that is the key to understand about status effects. The aforementioned resistance. If you do too much of something, the opponent will get it into their mind that that's how you intend to beat them, and will become resistant to the effect. This may make them more susceptible to another effect. It's all just conditioning. That is a term that is normally used for it. But the usefulness of thinking of it as a status effect is, for those of us who are familiar with this type of game, we know that status effects after a while will wear off if you don't reapply them. And that is true here too. A Lara player eventually wants to get in and do other stuff. So eventually they're going to quote-unquote stop thinking about the fact that you sweep them in those spaces. In fact, you can have a lot more success by not waiting for this thing to happen over and over again. By not attempting to set up that situation, but only to recognize, oh, the effect has worn off now. Therefore, I can probably reapply it safely. But you can see in that exchange, they were expecting it at that point. They had become resistant to the sweep, mostly by staying completely out of the way of it. But you do note they weren't hitting buttons, they weren't really trying to do a specific thing relative to it. But by Amara continuing to do it, it ended in their favor. Because it's basically trying to apply an effect that your opponent recognizes and won't be caught by anymore. A higher level player would just generally not do it at all and go, okay, I'll wait until I see that you are susceptible to this effect again. When you've shown me that your tendencies have returned to your normal, and then I'll just use it one more time and get some damage off it, because these status effect style things tend to chain. We were fortunate enough that in this session it moved slowly toward more and more complex characters and more complex effects. As you get to higher levels, of course, people are better at punishes, people are better at timings and expectations, and therefore it really doesn't come up as often. But you build up better ones by then, so it doesn't really matter as much there either. In that moment, basically, Amara could have recognized on the dashes that, well, V-skill forward, this effect has worn off of you. You're about to probably dash again. Because, interestingly, a lot of people react to effects wearing off. This is the first thing that people tend to stop doing, but in Bronze, you can be pretty sure that a lot of people are going to react to the fact that the effect you were putting on them has now in some way worn off in their mind. Their confidence or their bravery has returned, and now they just go back to whatever they were doing before. So here, doing the sweep would not necessarily have been the best thing to do immediately, but it still works here. And had they moved forward, it would have been fine. The fact that they didn't really also didn't lead to anything bad. You can also get flustered when you are cornered in such a way that you could have a particular reaction you're supposed to have, but it just won't come out because you're flustered. You aren't even thinking about it anymore. You're thinking about the fact that you're being pushed back, and being cornered is in itself the thing that makes you flustered. Which is why the two effects are close to each other depending on your character. So again, we went up one level of difficulty, relatively. The status effect in terms of Guile is harder to explain because it's more specific per character, but Guile only has one or two actual effects that take on him. For the Guile Ryu matchup is fairly simple. Guile wants to jump in with heavy kick. At most levels, actually. Guile wants to throw sonic booms until you get frustrated, and then jump in with heavy kick. Now, as you know, if you've watched the stream a lot, Amara loves to parry jumping heavy kick. But it's not that simple. So as you can see, there's a lot of interactions here that look as if they're not patterned, as if they can't be understood, but that's not remotely true. You have to be careful not to spend every moment you can waiting for something, because again, effects don't work that well in those cases. But this is around the part of the match where I started to explain in full how the Guile thing works. When Guile is far away, he's still just looking for a way to get in and do jumping heavy kick. High level players will just happily throw sonic boom at you the entire day, but against Ryu this won't even work. But you'll note that because she's adjusting to it, because she's adjusting to the idea that, wait, this isn't random, this isn't just them doing stuff because, no. So she's still getting hit. In fact, the fact that you believe it's random is what causes the hit to happen. You're not as prepared as you could be. You're the one under Guile's status effect at that point. In terms of Mish-Mashing, this match will continue to not go well because there's a certain combo that Amara needs to practice that is for punishing this. But overall, at lower levels, you can pretty much assume that Guile is going to jump in with that heavy kick whenever he gets a chance, and then you have to understand what a chance looks like. Even if you actually did anti-air it most of the time, he'd still do it. Because Guile is so limited in options overall, especially if you don't go in on him yourself, that he has to do something. And if you're familiar with the concept of how zoners fight in general, they have a tendency to use their longest buttons so that they can jump from further ranges and do more damage. Especially since they don't tend to use big combos anyway. So the effect we're looking for here doesn't need to have a name, because it probably wouldn't help overall. It's too different per character in terms of how you have to deal with Guile overall. But now we will go into the match where Amara basically stopped doing anything but focusing on that part of it. with the hope being that we would simply see a pattern that was patterned enough to defeat. I find this lack of connection disturbing. There we go. It took a little long to get around to finding it. So at this point, she's not even trying to win the match. She's just looking for enough of a belief in what they're doing to learn how to deal with Guile in terms of effects later. The concept being that Guile wants to jumping heavy kick, and Ryu can parry the jumping heavy kick. So what makes Guile want to do that? Well, why go to him at all? Eventually, especially if you can throw fireballs just as well as he can, he has to come to you. It may not seem that way, but in order to beat fireballs well enough, especially with Guile versus Ryu, Guile must successfully get that out. And if you are a really dedicated Ryu player, you learn to do this eventually, because Guile has a fault in the way his stuff is done. He cannot generally easily throw Sonic Boom with the slightly incorrect timing that comes up here. So eventually, if you're patient, you can either force him to only do regular Sonic Booms, which then allows you to do Tatsu, or to occasionally get clipped like that. But note, once again, here comes the jumping heavy kick. Now that was jumping heavy punch, and that is the one effect part that matters to someone like Amara. They do eventually jump with a different button. They could empty jump as well. But because of a lower level player's focus on certain things, their focus is actually going to loop back to wanting to do that jumping heavy kick. So you have to give them time to get back there mentally, or you might actually get caught. Especially if you don't punish particularly well and they get to jump again. By that time, their thought process has changed, and now they're thinking about, okay, I could probably jump with a different button. But give enough autopilot time, and they'll still do it. But here you have the option of them jumping with a different button, because Amara didn't fully punish them with the combo she needs to practice. And there's the final part. Once Guile's V-trigger is active, he has options. At least Guile players feel as if they have options. And it resets them. It's basically saying, I'm going to take off my own effect. But a harder punish, especially one that managed to push him away and let you reset the situation enough to force them to have to keep on throwing more Sonic Booms and get back to the state of, let's call it frustration, to jump in would have led back to more or less the same thing happening. Of course, this would only last for about 4 or 5 applications. There are many opponents in RPGs, and to some extent certain MOBAs, where once you've hit them with a certain effect like 4 times, they build up a resistance to it over time. And this is what affects longer sets more so than anything else at mid-level. So now let's move on to Karine, who is even more complicated. Because Karine, like Cammy, is an offensive character, but her movements are very different. A lower level Karine looks at Ryu as someone who is going to try to zone them, but at the lower level, they're not usually so confident in their ability to seppo through fireballs. But Rosenha works. And as a result of this, you will find that a lot of lower level Karine will do about... Rosenha is almost like a meter to them. They start off with it mentally. They do it to see what you will do after a little while. It's either that or dash up, really. If you defend well enough for long enough from the Rosenha, then they'll do some other stuff for a little while and then they'll go back and start Rosenhas again. It's also time, as you can see. You stand still long enough and their meter in their head builds back up. Here we see the same problem, however, where the required punish to force her away is the habit that Amara needs to work on. But conceptually it's not that different. You stand over here. Once you're close it's more frenzied and so on, but give them enough time and there's another one. But once they get punished heavily enough for one, it more or less empties the meter. It might not empty it completely. Different people have different timings and resistances based on their playstyles. But you'll still see it. If you feel as if things are random, just look for patterns in terms of how things happen rather than trying to win for a bit. Especially in ranked. In casual, people will try different things, they'll try to learn different things. They won't autopilot to their winning strategy because they're not necessarily as invested in winning. Most of us don't immediately play ranked if we want to test out things or practice. So having had that explained, we're now going to see Amara spending more time focusing on her opponent's quote-unquote Rosenha meter. I estimated to her that this person has about 3 charges in their Rosenha meter if they aren't punished at all. It stays a little bit longer if they get at least a little damage, but usually not. And minor punishes don't dissuade them too much. So we have that. And 2. Because as far as they're concerned, they have pressure. At this point, the meter is building back up. Because they're close in, they're doing stuff. And there you go. Rebuilt. So 2. Since 1 was successful. Now the hard part to understand here is, do they start the round with it or not? Well, let's assume they still have half a charge. There we go. 1. Oh, but it was only half a charge, so they ran out, more or less. So now it's rebuilding. This person does adapt a little bit. I will fully admit that. They adapt to... but they're adapting to defensiveness now. This is part of the reason why it's so important to be able to do optimized combos. The stage that you grind in the game, the reason you grind your optimized combos, if there's ever a timing in a person's life when I tell them now is the time to perfect all your combos, is when you understand this concept. Now obviously, that is another reset style thing similar to Guile. Most characters have a way to change the situation entirely using their V-trigger, and it quote-unquote erases all their debuffs. So 1. 2, 3, and that looks like 4, and you'd go, well, here's 4, so it doesn't work. Except that's not really true, because number 1 got pushed back, so there was time for the meter to go back up to full. And as the person adapts more and more, you will see more and more activity and more changes. But that doesn't really mean things are changing too terribly. They should have one more in them, but they got hit back. Oh look, there it is. So if you had started off to thinking to yourself, wait, they have one more, maybe I should wait for it, then you just win. Now we get to the third and most complicated part of this. Your aim is generally to beat your opponent before a third match, because in a third match they have probably built up enough resistance to not get caught in status effects anymore. The main thing that helps offset this is, again, optimized combos. The more damage you do, the less interactions you have, and the less time your opponent has to recognize that they've been hit by status effects in neutral. The quicker you can beat someone, the less time they have to think about the fact that your defenses are good. Because now, it's likely that this person will start to quote-unquote suppress their Rasenha meter. Delay it for as long as they can, but not necessarily immediately. See? They did something to make you think, okay, I'm not gonna just Rasenha, but they still Rasenha. Still, there is some holding back here, but again, it's really autopilot. It's difficult for people to completely hand over their autopilot, especially when they're thinking, maybe it'll work now. Maybe it'll work now. And then they realize, hey, it's working! And they return to it. But by this time, Amara was more so thinking, wait, how do I actually parry this and what do I do after it? She no longer particularly cared about the match. But as you can see, that was 3, so they started off the round quote-unquote without it. There are other ways to explain this psychologically, by far. But these are the ones that will help you when you do not know anything about the opponent. But that one was that Rasenha was effectively due to happen. And she had super meter, so chances are she could have just parried more. I had told her at the time, if it were me playing, or if I had realized, if I could speak fast enough to you, I would have just told you parry more. That is what high level players are doing to you when they seem to stop all your stuff with their really awesome abilities. They're not actually just super predicting you. You are, as Gieshauer said, predictable, and therefore, to them, it's just a progression in statuses that they can see, however you want to perceive it, and from there they just chain them together and win. Chaining them together is one of the things that pushes them so far above people in bronze for sure, most people in silver. The understanding that by putting one effect on a person, they move to try a particular other thing, and then they just counter that other thing. And the chain goes on until usually they've won perfectly. They even do this to each other. It's just that the status effects they put on each other are much more complicated. So, fittingly, we are back on this stage for the character that is immune to cornered. This isn't to say that if you rush and try to pressure Chun-Li in the corner, especially when she has no meter, that the person won't get flustered. But cornered isn't about getting flustered when you're there. Cornered is about not being able to get out. But fortunately, low-level Chun-Li is a really simplistic character in terms of status effects. You'd think that her technical bent would cause her to have a lot of specific ways around things, but she mostly doesn't, especially not against zoning characters. Her strength is that she builds up the meter quickly enough to use it and reset herself often, but such are the white mages of the world. So Chun-Li starts off from trying to walk into a position where she can jump, hit a particular button and trick you. She has a lot of good jump-in buttons, and they vary in terms of when they hit you and how. She can even vary what time in the jump they hit you relative to your own feelings, and beat you out because she trains you to anti-air one way and then that anti-air becomes incorrect. So Chun-Li players are looking for that. However, once you do anti-air them a couple times, what you get after that is them walking back and forward trying to find a way in. But there's not a lot of ways in. Her floaty jump is one of the largest possible balancers to this character because of that. But once you've dealt with that, once you've recognized, I don't need to do anything because your main goal is standing where you can jump at me. But since in order to do every other move she has to keep quiet or walk backward, predictably, you can take advantage of that and recognize, oh, well, all I have to do really is learn what happens at each jump in range, and then you will have to try to play neutral like this. The mistake Amara made there was to forget that you really don't have to play neutral with most Chun-Li at this level. The tools she has to force you to play neutral are all risky, and people don't like taking risks. So once she's far enough away, you just need to be able to whiff punish a long button. And Ryu's method for doing this is actually his crouching heavy punch. Crouching heavy punch is good because this version of it is relatively hard to whiff punish from the opponent side, but it is in turn very fast, it has a good hitbox in most places, and it's hard to get hit while doing it. It's also not likely to hit someone's block if you were trying to whiff punish with it. So the final result is actually just wait until Chun-Li has moved into a situation or a position where she doesn't want to jump because she realizes that you're too aware of her jump in space, and prepare to hit crouching heavy punch at basically any timing that you think will work. And for Ryu, that can often be the entire matchup. You don't need to push her to the corner because, as I noted, she's basically immune to that. Why is she immune to that? She's immune to that because at the range that most people stand to guard the corner, and with the buttons they have to press and stick out in order to do it, unlike most characters, Chun-Li has at least 4 ways to deal with that. If you stand too close, she will just probably do legs, which is only 5 frames, and whiff punishes a lot of things. If you try to walk forward and then walk backwards to freak her out, she will do her sliding medium punch. She can also just jump off the wall itself and go over. She can do spinning bird kick, which whiff punishes a bunch of things. And she can rank Yaku if she thinks that you are going to be too twitchy on the anti-air, and she will just get over your head. So this is not a character that fears this. They don't like being fully pushed into the corner, but once they're there, see? They'll just hit certain buttons and go, okay, I can get back out of here. Chun-Li players don't worry about that very much. It's only very few characters that will make them worry about it. Zangief, they'll worry about it to some extent. But most people know. So, how does Ryu do this? Ryu does this by when Chun-Li gets too far away, just start throwing fireballs. Because she doesn't jump far enough forward to reach him. She has to either slide perfectly under it or jump with no risk to Ryu whatsoever. And as soon as you see her jump, you know you can't throw another fireball anyway because yours is still on the screen. You just stop moving. Same thing happens if she manages to slide under the fireball. It's still on the screen, you can't do much, just stop moving. She takes long to recover from the move anyway. And Amara is generally not very scared of Chun-Li corner pressure because she trains with me a lot. And knows that sort of trick. But that moment where Chun-Li is standing a little too close to you, that's the main range at which you don't throw the fireball. And there you see, approaching a little bit too much, hoping to catch them on the way up, but they ran Kyaku right out of the corner. So, Chun-Li and Akuma are on opposite ends of the spectrum. Akuma reacts to being in the corner very heavily, and Chun-Li reacts pretty much not at all. You can probably bait her into doing something, but then you have to know what the something is. But this match is more or less, I can't throw fireballs from here, but I can see that as soon as she jumps, I don't get to attack, but I get to do something. Now, as for what you decide to call these particular status effects, it's not that relevant. And you did see them still get hit by things. But it was nowhere near as easy as it was to just wait for Akuma to do something and hurt him. It did take, in this case, EX meter probably could have been just medium, but EX solves the reaction problem. If it's Rankyaku, EX will hit it in time. Medium, sure you can might miss, depending on where you're standing. We're going to basically probably be devoting the whole week to this concept so that it's easier to fully understand it. This is clearly a lot to absorb, and a lot of it can seem pretty random. I tend to pack a bit too much information into initial lessons, but there will be reviews. I don't remember if this Akuma was a laggy one. I'll know when I see it. So now we're going to start looking at the bad habits, quote-unquote, part of the stream, where Amara gets status effects placed on her without recognizing that that's happening. But I'm also going to outline a couple more Akuma things that are matchup related, but they're more so specific to Ryu versus Akuma or Ken versus Akuma, so it won't apply to most people. One of them is universally useful, but so again, you'll note Akuma tends to jump with buttons. As a general rule, a character who has a lot of good jumping buttons is more likely to keep hitting jumping buttons. They're not as likely to empty jump because they feel as if they have a lot of good options to take you off guard. So at least at this level, it's easier for Amara to just assume that Akuma will always hit a button on jump in, even though most of them should recognize the situation. But note one point. If you did manage to parry it but couldn't hurt them, you couldn't reset it enough to take their mind off it again, they would get what we consider a buff. The buff of expectation in terms of thinking you will do this, therefore I need to counter it. All you need to do is wait for that buff to wear off. It's a very short buff. It builds up over time. It gets longer and longer every time it happens. But at the beginning it's really short. So if you fail to parry something, or fail to punish properly after parrying it and your opponent gets another chance to jump, it's not really that you should then expect them to empty jump. It is specifically that you should no longer feel as if you should assume anything. It becomes a mix-up because they have the buff. The buff itself is not a particular direction of thought that they definitely will go in. A buff means you are now at disadvantage. You don't know what's going to happen. Your opponent has control of the situation, and you are the one whose thoughts are muddy in some way. We have one more Ryu specific thing in here, which has to do with whether or not you parry a red fireball. If you parry a red fireball at a certain range, it will cause the Akuma player to either throw another one, unlikely, or at least less likely, or to attempt to shift themselves in such a way that they get to jump. They may also walk forward in order to throw the other one after that, but it is really easy once you recognize the walking forward. When they walk forward after a red fireball, they are not usually aiming for the basic jump because they have telegraphed their movements so heavily. The problem being, the second red fireball is equally telegraphed, at least against a character like Ryu or Kami who can just use a different move to go through it. The final effect is that once Akuma does move from the full range of a red fireball that has been parried, or even sometimes not quite so far out, most Akuma at this level want to get in by jumping because they don't want to get Hadoukened, so they tend to jump. But the range from which they jump, it's not even like Chun-Li where the button they're likely to jump in with is going to stop you. Ryu has a particular ability to jump over them with his cross-up button and land it as if it's a cross-up simply because of the interactions in space in the air. And most of the time, because of something relative to trip guard, not necessarily trip guard, they're not going to be ready to respond to that. But again, like everything else, it's not as easy as just saying, okay, I can just do that the entire time then. The reason we use those terms is because it gives people who play MOBAs or who play RPGs a simpler way to understand the psychological processes that players use that change when their way of thinking shifts. So what you see here, Amara took a little bit too long to get back from there, but you can see that you immediately do exactly the same thing. And had she been playing exactly the same as before and remembered, oh right, you all get flustered when I corner you, and then you jump, and then I hurt you, this match would have been over. Because it's not as if they jumped empty, and it's not as if they jumped with particularly finessed timing. It's just that she was expecting other things to potentially happen. So we have the red fireball again, and the jump, and that's the jump I'm talking about. Akuma is not a zoner. And by my definition, why Akuma is not a zoner is because he can't throw a fireball from a spacing like that, and then jump in with a button and it work. That is the definition of a rushdown character. Most characters will not be allowed to have all the abilities. So we see the fireball, but Amara reacted. And at this point I was trying to tell her, they're not going to ever make that jump. It just won't happen. When they try, all you have to do is jump as if you wanted to cross them up. Unfortunately, I think I told her this between rounds, so this one doesn't necessarily go well. That was just the wrong Tatsu. But again, it would seem as if, oh well, yeah, this is really easy to do when you're not the one playing. That's true, because we get status effects on us that block us from being able to make the best of our own skills and talents. And understanding which status effects you are susceptible to lets you tailor your training regimen to grind those out. And that is probably one of the easiest ways to have more fun in Street Fighter. To purge the things that lead to you getting put under bad status, and then you just tend to enjoy the game more as a general thing. Even if you're still losing, the reason you're losing is not the same. The experience feels different and you're not as stressed out. So, fortunately, here came the next match. A mirror match in which I could then easily point out to her what exactly it is that people do to Ryu and what she may be susceptible to without recognizing it. Ryu players are easily slowed. Now, this doesn't usually matter because Ryu isn't very weak to slow. In other words, it doesn't affect him too much once it's on him. He's a character who is built to be defensive. Slowing him doesn't really do much. You have to have something beyond that. But it also means that if he is slowed and someone manages to break his defense, he immediately goes to fluster. It's kind of a chain. Because Ryu's belief, both as a character and most people who play him, is that their defense has to be good, and whenever the defense fails for a moment, they get flustered by it and try to reset to a comfortable or well-known situation so that they can ground themselves again. This, for example, you can see made Samara twitchy because she intended a particular thing and suddenly got hit instead. These basic interactions are not so much. They don't have a specific meaning. This was just the other person not managing to break her defense too well. But this moment is not the same thing. So you can see she still got a little twitchy. But in the world of optimized combos, that would have been a kill with super, and therefore none of this would have mattered. It's not that it went terribly, but here you have another 10 to 20 seconds of the opponent learning things, and you don't want that. Because this opponent learned, oh, slow actually works on you. Slow actually makes it so that you don't react to my dash in throw. And that was a piece of information that they wouldn't have had without a dropped combo. So, practicing your combos isn't always about doing damage. It's about denying your opponent extra information in a match. This is partly why it's frustrating to lose to characters with extremely high damage output, because if it happens really quickly, you feel as if you didn't learn anything. You should usually, against characters with that strong ability to instantly kill you, drag out the first round as long as possible. Especially if your own character relies a lot on defense and doesn't deal well with mix-ups. Drag out that first round so that you can learn things about your opponent. But overall, status effects still help. So we're going to see where this progressed, unfortunately. Because they recognized, okay, I can slow you, and once I have done that, I can throw you. But I did recognize what was happening, and I did point out something to her to let her overcome it as quickly as possible. Basically, that they're the same character. Her opponent, while they may be a little better about it, has the same problem. If you slow them, you get to throw them, like that. To the point where, if you can slow them from close enough, you can guard break them. You can set them up for the throw. But, obviously, this doesn't happen a lot. You can't just do it whenever you want, because it is like the effect mentioned before. It wears off very fast. Or it stays really long, depending on how you dealt with the situation. Now, since Ryu has less jump-in buttons, you'll see more of that. But her opponent immediately went to the same guard break. The Ryu versus Ryu matchup is basically about guard break, and the guard break is usually in the form of their standing medium kick. The exchanges go about normally, and it wouldn't look to most people as if that standing medium kick is deciding the match, but I promise you that large amount of the time it is. Why? The specific reason is that stand medium kick is the thing that lets Ryu do the most things afterwards. This is not true for every character. They have to have a fairly lateral long one. But at the same time, Ryu players who pride themselves on their defense learn to read situations. The problem is that stand medium kick is probably the most neutral situation in this game. At least a long standing medium kick. You have no idea what your opponent is going to do after that. But Ryu players are reactive, and they'll want to. And because they want to, they get slower. So slow that it's effectively guard break. But Amara can train on that. Amara can train on what her reaction to standing medium kick should be. In this case, it can actually be backdash. She can just backdash from standing medium kicks in most cases. And it won't gain her anything, but it will stop that particular slow or guard break, because doing the backdash will generally help. And most of the characters who have strongly pursuing moves that will catch the backdash, other than Cammy, and to some extent Karine, don't have lateral ones in the first place. But now we're moving into the Juri matchup. This is a terrible matchup for Amara most of the time, but there is a trick to it. Juri is a character that can get a specific status effect that other characters mostly don't get. We will consider this to be literally confuse. She is a footsies character who has to build up her own actual buffs, i.e. the ability to do certain moves. She has really good control once she's controlling the space. Once she can tell where you are and where you will be, Juri is a very powerful character. Her buttons are just long enough and just quick enough to really stress you out. What she lacks is the ability to respond quickly to very fast moves. She'll either block them or just get flustered, i.e. confused. So the status effect confuse in this case is applied to Juri by dashing forward. Just once. Doesn't require you to do anything else. You can just block if you want. Just dash forward, and in Ryu's case, if you don't think they're going to react immediately, throw a Hadouken, do a light Shoryu, whatever. Because the Juri player then has to worry about you moving closer to them and potentially doing just about anything. But at the range that Juri optimally wants to stand at, a single dash won't put you in range of much other than her medium kick. And her medium kick will get hit by Hadoukens. And that's the part of it that makes it confuse. She's not a character you can generally throw fireballs at and expect anything good to happen. But the moment you start dashing at her in neutral, you gain the ability to throw the fireball at her too. And if this keeps up for long enough, Unlike most effects where it wears off, Confuse is not like that. Confuse tends to build up. Because the player must now spend a lot more time worried about your spacing than their own. And they start to do things like moving because they feel pressured to move before you randomly suddenly move. As you can see, unlike other characters who can just hit a relatively safe button that doesn't move them forward, Juri's biggest chance for hurting you when you do that involves her literally hopping at you. She has to build up a particular buff, i.e. her own fireball, which can take a while. Her sweep is long, but not long enough that she can just do that, and it is relatively whiff punishable as sweeps go. But even so, it really doesn't matter because the sort of character that needs to do this against Yuri has a fireball. So that was actually the only thing really required to deal with Yuri. Just apply Confuse as much as possible. So we're going to look at the other side of the effect that the Juri player applies to Amara. And Juri is good at status effects, because Juri requires the opponent to keep track of so many things that, honestly, if you're playing Juri really well, you don't really have to worry about the fact that your opponent can see which move you stored. If you are keeping their focus occupied heavily enough, just by moving around in neutral and using her very good jump arc, they don't have time to focus on the fact that you charged this particular thing. Especially if you don't do it on the knockdown where they recognize they have time, or if the person tends to quick rise a lot and try to hit you. You get a lot out of that. You could even specifically build up a tactic of standing just out of range of their wake up and charging right there, so that they're focused more so on the wake up than on you actually doing anything. And if they decide, well, I'm not dealing with any of that, I'm going to leave you alone, I'm going to walk over here until I can see which move you charged, you just charge the other one and then you have all and it doesn't matter anymore. But as you can see, Amara isn't really applying Confuse as much. Which means that the Juri player gets to decide the spacing. And while Amara's defense continues to be good, Juri's control of the spacing means that it's very much more stressful to fight her than nearly any other character. So the status effects that are being applied here are actually too numerous to count. But just remember to watch for Amara's dashes. Fortunately, most players don't have really good defense with Juri and it doesn't come up. Infiltration, on the other hand, if you've been watching lately, can pinwheel on reaction while doing all of this and makes things terrifying. So she's applied slow, cornered, confuse, all at once. And once you've got that combination, Juri players know that they can just air throw you. It's actually almost textbook. They can even go so far as to say, well, okay, I've cornered you, but you don't have slow on, so I have to do this different thing. Fortunately, again, Amara's defense holds. But again, just for that moment, the Juri player got control of the spacing again. And throwing out medium kick like that is a good way to discourage people from doing this, and therefore get back control of the match. It isn't necessarily going to lead to that much. Most people can't confirm it on a dash in the first place. But Deterring other people from dashing is how she slows people. And once you're slowed, she will use her superior speed and superior jump arc to get in on you and defeat you. Now fortunately, Mara did in fact win that first match. But now we're going into the third round, and as I said, you don't really want to reach a third round. By a third round, it's basically the same as meeting a new monster in some RPG. You've learned how to deal with them, you've learned all the moves they can do, you've learned what status effects they can put on you, and what status effects are effective when put on them. So at this point, the jury player knows, I can slow you. I can trigger cornered on you. And those two things are probably enough. Amara will attempt Confuse, so this is just a battle of status effects at this point. Confuse 1. Note the medium kick. Have control of the spacing. Confuse again. Note again the control of the spacing. But this space has made Amara worried about trying to continually apply Confuse. But Juri sort of petrifies over time. She slows you and puts a bunch of status effects on. Unless you are playing a very aggressive character or one that has a lot of good escapes, she simply has too many effects on you for you to escape. It's in her character design. This is what spiders do to you. So you'll note that even though technically Amara's not taking a lot of damage, she is still keeping up her own defense. As the jury player right now, I wouldn't be worried at all. I would be considering that I have already won this match. Little things like that are not going to bother me too much. Because look, mostly they have managed to control the space enough to keep her from even actually using the Confuse to throw Hadoukens, because the counter moment is not there. And here's the fluster moment. And the fireball is basically the only thing that stops that from turning into terrifying. Build up, and done. That was actually 6 effects, but the lower level of play doesn't really require you to know this many unless you fight Juri really often. And most characters have enough damage output and specifics of their own flow that you don't really need to know them to beat her. Probably only Zangief, Chun-Li, Ryu, and Alex actually need to know all of Juri's status effects to try to resist them. So from there we're winding down because now we're into repeats, basically. And the level of your opponent can give you a very good idea of how they deal with the status effects. In this case, this level 2 Guile. This is the time where character familiarity matters. Especially if they're coming from another character who is less susceptible to the same effect. So, again, for Guile, note this is a completely different person. We're gonna wait for the jumping heavy kick. Full screen, and there's 1. There's 2. There's 3. This isn't because, oh, everyone does this at low levels. It's because Guile doesn't have a ton of better options. He's a zoning character. He's supposed to do this. And he is good in that, depending on how high he hits that, he can change when you need to worry about it. So, it is an all-purpose button. But Amara can easily turn this around if she focuses on the fact that it will always be coming. It's just how the character works and the effect it causes. But, as you can see here, this player has an extra part of it. They know how to walk in and do crouch medium kick. And that can fluster someone who is not familiar with Guile. But it's not really much different from the Lara. All you have to do mostly is wait for him to do something and hit sweep, because Guile can only do 3 things in those situations. He can throw another Sonic Boom, which might hit you or it might even trade. He can try to walk forward if he's been just out of range so he could hit you again. But Guile doesn't have anything good from that range that forces you to stop down backing, so he doesn't really do anything. He can walk him and try to throw, but his walk speed is not quite good enough to get away with this. It's actually quite fast, but the spacing he's standing at and the buttons he can normally hit to lead into any real damage don't come from him just walking forward at you. If he did, you could probably just hit sweep anyway. He's also not a character who in most parts of the match will throw out a ton of damage based on the fact that you did sweep and he blocked it. But of course, reading when to sweep against Guile is relatively hard, so the effect is, again, slow. He gets away with a lot of crouch medium kick, even though technically if this move hits you, it's -4 and you get to attack for free. The range is good, so... But now we're going to watch as Mara basically dismantles this person purely because of understanding the rhythm and understanding the status effect. If they're at full screen, they want to set up with the boom and then jump. There's the boom. But as you know, the parry missed partially because her timing was off and partially because Guile can change when that kick matters to you. And often does based on a lot of things. So put them in the corner and wait. I missed execution on the third, but it still ended in her favor. Guile is normally not very susceptible to cornered, but against Ryu he somewhat is. Now, the thing to keep in mind is, again, that once you've put a certain status effect on a person, it takes a little while. You have to do something to cause them to stop thinking about it. Because they'll go, okay, right, I shouldn't jump with that. But they'll forget fairly fast. Here's that moment. And look, here it is again. But now you have to once again reset it so that they're willing to do it again. So we'll throw a couple stuff. Do some slightly unexpected things. But because they jumped in with it and she didn't punish properly, they had time to reset the situation, to think to themselves, oh right, I'm not supposed to do that. Could have been parried. So when I say dismantle, I didn't necessarily mean wins by a large margin. But if you watch the match in terms of whether or not the interactions were going in her favor or not, there's some dropped combos, there's some mistimed parries, but there was never a point of, I don't know what to do here. It was just not being able to do it. So again, I repeat, once you understand this, you're probably going to want to grind a lot of your combos, because the next thing that frustrates you after you pass this plateau is, I keep on dropping too much damage and my opponent gets too much information about me because I drop the damage. And the two are very important together. It's not simply that you're dropping damage, because you'd figure, well, okay, if they never touch me, then it doesn't really matter. But this isn't true. It's part of what makes Chun-Li a difficult character to play. It's part of what makes Colleen a difficult character to play. It's part of what makes Cammy high tier, even though technically they're all playing the same style of game. It's why Guile is still high, but not superbly high. Because all of these little moments of balance matter. You put in one extra bar on his V-trigger, he doesn't have as many setups or similar things, and suddenly your opponent has time to figure you out if you're a Guile player. But this moment, this is just, oh, okay, well, I could just wait and see. Because you're down blocking anyway. All you basically have to do is go, is that going to hit me? You don't even have to actually wait until the move hits or misses if you're really good at it. You just look and go, oh wait, that looks like the start of a medium kick. I don't think that's going to hit me. I should just hit sweep. That's why you won't see pros do that particular thing, because they'll just get whiff punished for it. And that is how they do the whiff punishing. Whiff punishing is about measuring the distance between two characters, and when you see the startup of a move you recognize, just hit the correct whiff punish button. You're not going, oh, right, this button is whiff punished by that, and no, it's a range thing. So you're usually ready already. And if you're getting hit by the move, you can't usually do the whiff punish anyway, so you just hit the button anyway. There are many situations where you can safely do it. You just react to whatever you perceive as the startup moment, and that's that. Now this Guile is relatively weak to cornered, as noted. But Guile is generally not, and they quickly think their way out of it. Guile is generally not weak to it because he has a lot of good moves that move him forward, and that was, remember that was the key. The reason Akuma is easily defeated this way is because he doesn't have a lot of normals that move him forward. At least not ones that can't get totally pummeled by something. So now we're going into the last jury matches. We'll consider those the end of the stream. I'm going to run all four. They're not that long. And the reason they're not that long is because even though Confuse does work on jury, again, knowing how to apply your own status effects to other people is not sufficient to win. You have to be able to resist theirs as well, or things are just going to collapse. So this match is basically trying to apply it. But this one was special because, and I had to point it out at the time, especially against Ryu, a jury that chooses to jump at that range with light kick should be considered to be a different character altogether. He can't parry her. it's difficult to anti-air her correctly. In other words, the anti-air reaction is much tighter. You have to be much more aware of a lot of things. This is technically pressure jury, but it's not even that. It's just another form of space control. But rather than using her walk speed, they use the fact that they can start that attack so quickly from nearly anywhere, while also making the opponent worry about a ton of other things. You have to be so ready to anti-air. And again, the space control matters. Most characters with jumping light kick, it's not this good. They can't make a light kick as ambiguous and still be sure that they'll get most of their combos or pressure regardless of that. Juri is one of the few characters where that is not necessarily guaranteed, but troublesome enough. The other such characters are Rainbow Mika and to some extent M. Bison, but Bison uses medium kick for this. But Juri is built to do this. So rather than using their space control on the ground, they use their space control in the air, and they just apply a different effect. They don't bother to actually put slow on you, they just put haste on themselves. Which is effectively relatively the same thing. Except that since the game does have a certain amount of input lag, we're not all practiced and we don't see Juri that often. We may see her more now. But she's not generally a super popular character to actually play. Most of us don't know all of Juri's little mix-ups. And most people who play her are usually trying to find some way to optimize her damage instead of optimizing her status effects. So, how do you beat a Juri that does this? You dash around even more. Because it's the same thing. She is controlling space through movement, and the only way you're going to keep up without getting outspeeded is to do the same thing yourself. But that moment there of, okay, I'm walking backward to defend, you're already in the web, you've already lost. So this entire sequence is just, oh, well, you're going to give me complete control of the movement of the match? Thank you! In order to win this, Amara would have had to basically randomly Shoryuken. This also works on Rashid's, but not all of them. Rashid's another character who can play two different ways, against Ryu at least. But it doesn't even have to be specifically randomly Shoryuken. It could be constantly being ready to Shoryuken instead of defending. Because, as you can see, moving backward is no longer a defense. But, because Ryu is a character that is easily slowed and it just normally makes no difference, it's easy for the Juri player to take advantage of that. We can consider this to be slow too if you want. Simply that Juri can become so much faster than a defensive Ryu that nothing short of V-reversal, and usually not even that, will do anything about it. But the stand heavy punch does help. And upon recognizing that, the question became, can we make something out of this? Can the stand heavy punch solve the problem? This is usually where adaptations come in. Unfortunately, I'm aware that it doesn't solve the problem by itself. It simply dispels the haste. She's still applying slow. It makes the difference less, but not enough. So let's say you start using the stand heavy punch, because it works as an anti-air too, especially against that particular kick. But you then have to still question, is this the right moment to hit it? Because if I hit it at the wrong moment, I'm still going to get hurt. But you'll note, it has really good pushback. And that is the thing that saves us in these matches. Realizing that this move has enough pushback to reset the space to a position that the jury player isn't necessarily expecting. But from there you have to know which button to use to keep it going. And in this case Amara didn't know that button, and therefore wasn't able to keep it up. Most likely she'll find some time to train just fine on it. But it's simply too many status effects to keep track of. Or, in this case, extremely strong ones. If you have a character who is good at doing this, that's great. If you are also the sort of player that easily shakes it off and does the almost always correct perfect anti-air, regardless of what that is for your character, then you're not really in much danger. Your ability to remove the effects from yourself is the thing that's saving you. Or, of course, being entirely immune to them, which is a thing that can happen. But unfortunately, Amara is not immune. Fortunately, this is not the same type of jury. Jury is a character that has so many different ways to apply these status effects that you'll probably never see the same one twice if you are only a casual player. And by that I mean someone who specifically only has a certain amount of time in a week to play this game. So this is back to the other original style of jury. If you watch her footwork, it's just a matter of, okay, I need to be exactly here so that you can't hit me, and then I can be exactly a little bit forward and hit you. Okay. And they learn this spacing per person. But because they're not mentally committed to doing a ton of damage, it's hard to catch them in certain things. But you'll note that it took a while before Amara tried to put Confuse on again. Partially because she was already winning by defense. I mean, there's usually no reason to try to apply an effect if you're already winning, because you don't want your opponent building up resistance to it. You might get surprised and lose. That's terrible, but here we have the immediate initial application and then more or less stopping. She has the life lead, she used it to get the life lead and then didn't keep it up. Because if this ends up going to a third round somehow, you want to keep your tricks. You don't want to show everything you know. This was something we saw at EVO. It wasn't so much a status effect in that regard, but it was similar, because Tokido spent almost the entire time without using Akuma's overhead against the cornered opponent, and then basically finally brought it out to win, because by that point opponent is already looking for so many other status effects that it's not going to be expected. But that got pulled back a bit too much. Now we're into third round. So, how does one get out of this? Well, basically, as you can see, the Confuse is absolutely required. Because that interaction, even that interaction, the jury player doesn't necessarily have to feel as if they're losing out. They can just keep doing this until your defenses break or you slow down too much to be able to counter them. But I believe that did help surprise them somewhat. and everything got close again. But unfortunately by that time she had her own buffs, and Amara doesn't have quite enough practice against Juri to punish everything correctly. But again, it brings you back to that. Understanding this is what makes you want to grind combos and grind punishes, because it feels often as if you've pushed yourself up to another level, you understand so much of what's going on in the game, and then it just becomes frustrating that you can't use that to win. It's doubly frustrating because it tends to feel as if you are quote-unquote the better player and still losing. But that's a rant for another time. Specifically a time in the past. You can check out Uncensored number 4, I believe. But this is the final match of this stream. And rather than gushing about Juri's status effects, I will point out one specific thing, one specific interaction that happens in this one. So far we know that this Juri player doesn't specifically respond to a bunch of things, and we know that Amara hasn't applied Confuse too heavily, as yet. But here we have one dash and Shoryu. But again, note, every time she dashes, something specific happens. It may not always be in her favor, but whenever she doesn't dash, if you look at who feels as if they have control of the match, it almost automatically goes back to the Juri player. They don't have to twitch, they don't have to worry. They start doing stranger and stranger things the more she dashes, and that is what Confuse is. That is what in this case Confuse 2 is. They become twitchy and start hitting buttons and start reacting to a dash that hasn't come yet, because reacting to one that is coming in slower from Ryu or Chun-Li or any character with like probably 17 frame dashes, I believe Lara as well, it's just not in most Juri players' mind at the time. They can't just throw out a fireball whenever they want to deal with the situation, for example. And depending on which move you use, her Fuha charges don't help. But the dash is stopped, and she went back to basically defense. So now they both have full meter, and it's coming down to the wire. One Shoryuken. But note something. She didn't punish the sweep. She didn't whiff punish the sweep. She didn't Hadouken after the sweep. Juri is one of the few characters in this game where the longer the fight goes on, the more status effect she gets on you and the more beneficial everything becomes for her. Most people who are not the type of person to just go all out get slower and slower and slower. As more effects get piled on, they become less and less able to fight this character. It's not even that she has too many options to actually figure out, it's that she's so good at defending herself after using her main ones. So here, we had the final moment of the match, the big reprieve. One sweep, and a jump back. Now at this moment, Amara has no life. The Juri player dashes forward, then does one move. And hits sweep. I am perfectly willing to believe, in fact, I'm completely convinced that that sweep was absolutely intentional. Because they had realized, I have slowed you so much that even this move that I know that is hugely minus, you are not looking for the block stun of this move. You are not thinking in terms of punishing this move. You just don't want to die. So you're going to hit a button. And I'll just sweep. And if you happen to not hit a button and you try to walk away from me, sweep will still work. That moment was the capstone of a full effect status pile from Jury. So as we go into the week, we're going to be looking at how Nash applies status effects, because he's another character that does it quite a lot. We're going to be figuring out whether or not we can make Nash bot able to apply them to the player, which is generally not really possible for most people because they are too aware that it's a bot. But you can still use it to at least watch for them in yourself. Just one of the few bots where there may not be a really strong point system, you'd end up being told specifically to autopilot and see what your autopilot looks like. And most likely during the week we will be seeing both Omni Rabbit dealing with this concept and Open Mic based on this concept, because there were more matches. I believe that was the end of the main session for a particular day. Yes, and it goes into the next day, starting with the same thing after a night to absorb it all. So if you want to see more of these matches and similar concepts, tune in on Wednesday for Open Mic with Kansuki Dynasty and Just Fine, where they will be discussing their perceptions of this, using Amara's other matches since then, or at least on the 10th. For now, this is Rillian for the 2_MK group, and I wish you all good night.